Under the gray autumn skies of Kyiv, the echo of another war meeting fills the presidential compound. Inside the marble halls of the Ukrainian government, Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga sits beside President Volodymyr Zelensky, his tone firm and deliberate. The topic: Europe's hesitation to tighten the screws on Russia. Sybiga begins, his words measured yet sharp. At the beginning of the full-scale Russian aggression, this figure was 9.3, he reminds the room, referring to the percentage of Russian imports still entering European markets. A significant decrease, but imports still take place. And we will also work with European partners. If, as of today, these types of products are not included in the sanctions packages, Mr. President, we will raise the issue of imposing tariffs on these types of products. That statement, both technical and political, lands with weight. It is not merely a matter of numbers, it's a warning wrapped in economic policy. Ukraine, now deep into its third year of full-scale war, is signaling to Brussels that patience is wearing thin. As the cameras pan across the table, Zelensky listens intently. His advisors take notes. Every word Sybiga speaks carries a dual audience, one in Kyiv, the other in the corridors of the European Commission. For Ukraine, the frustration is rooted in a familiar dilemma. While Europe has imposed more than a dozen rounds of sanctions on Moscow, certain goods, from fertilizers to metals and energy-related imports, continue to move through European ports. To Kyiv, these flows are not just trade, they are lifelines sustaining the Kremlin's war machine. The Ukrainian government is now pushing for what it calls a new phase in economic warfare, one that uses tariffs, not just sanctions, to choke off Moscow's access to hard currency. The logic is simple. If some EU member states block new sanctions, the bloc can still make Russian imports too expensive to sustain. This proposal comes as internal rifts widen within the EU itself. Several member states, particularly those with significant agricultural or energy dependencies, have hesitated to approve further sanctions, arguing that Europe's industries are already suffering from high energy costs and disrupted trade flows. But for Kyiv, such arguments ring hollow. In the eyes of its diplomats, every delay, every loophole, every exemption prolongs Russia's ability to finance its invasion. Inside the room, Sybiga's tone remains diplomatic but insistent. We will also work with European partners, he says again, echoing his own words for emphasis. If these products are not yet covered, then tariffs must be introduced. It's a calculated escalation, one that doesn't directly challenge Brussels, but quietly pressures it. The message is clear. If sanctions can't be passed, then economics will become the new battlefield. Ukraine's push for tariff-based penalties marks a strategic shift. Rather than relying solely on political consensus for sanctions, which require unanimity among EU member states, tariffs could potentially be introduced through a qualified majority. That means fewer opportunities for single countries to block the process. Analysts in Kyiv and Brussels are already dissecting the implications. By turning to tariffs, Ukraine may be opening a new front in its diplomatic campaign, one aimed at closing the gaps in Europe's economic defenses. Over the past 2 years, the EU has imported billions of euros worth of Russian goods, despite broad sanctions. Energy products, especially liquefied natural gas and certain petroleum derivatives, have been the most contentious. But other categories, such as chemicals, iron, and even luxury items, have quietly continued to flow. Sybiga's remarks, therefore, are more than a statement of frustration. They are a blueprint for what could become a coordinated European economic strategy. Behind the scenes, Ukrainian diplomats have been lobbying individual capitals, Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and Madrid, urging them to back tighter measures. Sources in the Foreign Ministry describe a two-track approach, one public, through official EU mechanisms, the other private, through bilateral negotiations and media messaging. Kyiv's tone has grown more assertive in recent months. Officials increasingly frame the issue not as a matter of solidarity, but of self-defense, for both Ukraine and Europe. As one advisor close to Zelensky told reporters earlier this week, every euro that goes to Moscow comes back as a missile to Kharkiv. The camera returns to the meeting table. Zelensky leans forward, nodding occasionally, as Sybiga's presentation continues. Charts on import data and trade flows are projected on a large screen behind them, visual proof of the slow but stubborn survival of Russian commerce across the continent. In Brussels, the timing of this message could not be more delicate. European leaders are currently debating the next tranche of sanctions, a process complicated by economic fatigue and political divisions. Some states, like Hungary and Slovakia, have openly resisted deeper measures against Moscow. Others, like Poland and the Baltic nations, have demanded harsher action, arguing that every loophole undermines the EU's credibility. For Ukraine, the distinction between sanctions and tariffs may seem procedural, but in reality it's deeply strategic. Sanctions are a blunt instrument of punishment. Tariffs are a sustained pressure tool. Together, they could form what Kyiv hopes will be a total economic quarantine of Russia. At the same time, Ukraine is keenly aware that Europe's unity is fragile. Officials in Kyiv have watched with concern as domestic politics within EU countries shift under the weight of inflation, migration pressures, and energy costs. Public fatigue with the war has crept into election debates across the continent. This is why Kyiv's message today is not only aimed at politicians, it's aimed at the European public. Ukraine wants voters in Paris, Berlin, and Rome to see Russian imports not as harmless trade, but as moral complicity. As Sybiga concludes his remarks, the room grows quiet. Zelensky thanks him briefly, then shifts to other topics: energy security, winter readiness, and reconstruction. But the cameras linger a little longer on the minister's notes. The phrase tariff mechanism is underlined twice. Outside, Kyiv's skyline glows faintly under a pale sunset. Air raid sirens remain silent, at least for now. The mood is weary but determined, a reflection of a nation that has learned to blend diplomacy and defiance in equal measure. Ukraine's new tariff push may soon test Europe's resolve. If Brussels accepts the proposal, it would mark the first time the EU deploys trade policy as a direct wartime instrument. If it rejects it, Kyiv may have to confront the limits of Western unity. The broader context is unmistakable. As the war drags on, the battlefield is no longer defined only by tanks and trenches, but by spreadsheets, trade routes, and customs codes. For Ukraine, every tariff is a statement of sovereignty. Every blocked Russian import is a quiet act of resistance. In the coming weeks, Sybiga is expected to meet his European counterparts in Brussels to formally present Ukraine's tariff proposal. Early reactions suggest cautious interest, particularly from countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, which have long advocated for stronger economic measures. However, skeptics remain. Economists warn that tariffs could also hurt European consumers, raising prices on goods already affected by inflation. Others question whether the policy would meaningfully deter Russia, given its growing trade ties with China, India, and the Middle East. Kyiv's answer is blunt. Europe cannot control Moscow's trade with Asia, but it can control its own conscience. The moral appeal has become a recurring theme in Ukrainian diplomacy, one that blends economic realism with emotional urgency. Each new proposal, each press conference, each soundbite is part of a broader narrative. Europe must choose not convenience but conviction. As night falls over Kyiv, the Foreign Ministry releases a short statement summarizing the day's meeting. It reiterates Sybiga's words almost verbatim. If sanctions cannot be expanded, tariffs must be applied. The phrasing is deliberate, restrained, yet loaded with intent. It signals that Ukraine is not waiting passively for Brussels to act. It is crafting its own playbook. In the war's third year, Ukraine's diplomacy has evolved from pleading for support to shaping the terms of engagement. Whether through weapons, aid, or trade policy, Kyiv now positions itself not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. In the corridors of European power, that shift has not gone unnoticed. Officials privately acknowledge that Ukraine's persistence often drives the EU's policy momentum. Each new Ukrainian demand forces the bloc to reconsider its red lines. What began as an emergency response to invasion has now become a test of Europe's political endurance. The question is not whether to support Ukraine, but how far Europe is willing to go to align its economy with its principles. Back in Kyiv, the lights in the presidential compound stay on late. Advisors continue to pore over reports and data. Outside, The distant hum of generators and the faint echo of passing vehicles fill the night air. For the officials inside, the economic battle is just another front in a long war. One fought not with artillery, but with policy papers and percentages. As the war stretches into yet another winter, Ukraine's message remains the same. The fight against Russia is not only on the battlefield, but in every market, every border crossing, every trade decision. In that sense, Andriy Sybiga's 27-second statement was not a mere soundbite. It was the start of a new offensive, one waged through diplomacy, economics, and persistence. And as Kyiv looks toward Brussels, the question now hangs in the air. Will Europe choose to share the burden of this economic war, or to bear the cost of its hesitation?